In 2018, a genetics team at Harvard pulled DNA from burial sites across ancient Mesopotamia, some of the oldest human remains ever tested. They compared the results against every known population database on the planet, modern and ancient, covering over 400 civilizations. The markers lined up with exactly 0 of them. Then in 2020, a second independent lab ran the same comparison and got the same result. The Sumerians don't match anyone, not their neighbors, not their descendants. Not a single population on Earth, but this story doesn't start with genetics. It starts with a question that archaeologists have been arguing about for over a century, a question so uncomfortable that most academic institutions avoid putting it in writing. Where did the Sumerians come from? Because unlike every other ancient civilization, nobody can trace them back to anywhere. Every major culture in the ancient world has an origin story that lines up with the physical evidence. The Egyptians came from North African herding groups who moved into the Nile Valley around 5000 BCE. The Harappans of the Indus Valley trace their roots to Iranian plateau populations who moved southeast. The Chinese civilizations connect to early East Asian founder groups around the Yellow River. These aren't guesses. They're conclusions backed by decades of digging records, language tracing, and now ancient DNA. The Sumerians have none of that. They appear in the archaeological record around 4500 BCE in southern Mesopotamia, in the marshlands between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Before them, the region was held by a group we call the Ubaid culture, simple farming communities who made painted pottery and mud brick houses. Their settlements were small. Their technology was basic. Their social structure showed no signs of central leadership. Then, within what appears to be a single generation, everything changes. Writing appears, not in a crude form, but as a fully developed system able to record complex deals, legal rulings, and star charts. Massive buildings appear, ziggurats and temple complexes needing organized work crews of thousands. Advanced math built on a base 60 system so sharp that we still use it for measuring time and angles. Legal codes. Water networks spanning hundreds of kilometers that required central planning and building knowledge that didn't exist anywhere else on the planet at that time. And a language. A language that language experts still cannot connect to any other language on Earth, living or dead. The Ubaid didn't evolve into the Sumerians. The Sumerians replaced them, and nobody can explain how. When Sir Leonard Woolley dug up the royal tombs at Ur in the 1920s, he expected to find evidence of slow cultural growth, the kind of gradual progress you see everywhere else in the ancient world. Instead, he found the opposite. The earliest Sumerian layers showed the same level of skill as the later ones. The gold work, the lapis lazuli imports from Afghanistan, the carnelian beads from the Indus Valley, the complex burial rituals, all of it was there from the beginning. Woolley called it the most puzzling problem in Mesopotamian archaeology. A century later, it still is. This is what scholars call the Sumerian problem, and it's been the most avoided question in ancient Near Eastern studies since the 1930s. The term was coined by Benno Landsberger, a German expert on ancient languages working at the University of Leipzig. Landsberger noticed that Sumerian had no language relatives. Not distant cousins, not worn-down links, nothing. Every other ancient language belongs to a family. Akkadian is Semitic, Hittite is Indo-European, Elamite connects to Dravidian languages. Sumerian connects to 0. Landsberger called this an impossible isolation, and he spent the rest of his career trying to solve it. He never found the answer. For decades, scholars proposed migration theories. The Sumerians came from the Indus Valley, they came from Central Asia, they came from the Caucasus Mountains. Each theory had 1 or 2 pieces of supporting evidence and dozens of holes. The problem was always the same. If the Sumerians moved from somewhere, there should be a trail. Pottery pieces that slowly shift in style, building methods that change along a route, borrowed words that show which languages they passed through. The Sumerians left none of that. They arrived fully formed. And that was before genetics entered the picture. In 2016, a team led by Iosif Lazaridis at Harvard's Department of Human Evolutionary Biology published a landmark study on ancient DNA from the Near East. The paper, which appeared in Nature, looked at genomes from over 40 ancient people spanning 12,000 years of human history in the region. They found what they expected to find in most cases. Populations showed clear genetic ties to their nearby neighbors and followed known migration paths. Anatolians connected to European farmers, Levantine populations connected to North African groups. Iranian plateau populations connected to South Asian civilizations. The genetic map of the ancient world made sense, except in southern Mesopotamia. The samples pulled from burial sites dating to the early Sumerian period showed a genetic profile that didn't group with any nearby population. Not the Akkadians to the north, not the Elamites to the east, not the early Arabian populations to the south. The Sumerian genetic signature held markers that appeared suddenly in the record with no earlier population to explain them. Lazaridis' team flagged the strange finding but didn't guess at its cause. In academic genetics, you report the data. You don't explain what you can't explain. But other researchers noticed. In 2019, a team at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, the same city where Landsberger first named the Sumerian problem, published a follow-up study using better methods for pulling DNA from old bones. Ancient DNA from Mesopotamia is famously hard to work with. The region's hot climate breaks down genetic material faster than almost anywhere else on Earth. Most samples give less than 1% usable human DNA. The rest is bacterial pollution. The Max Planck team built new ways to isolate and boost even tiny traces of ancient human DNA from these damaged samples. What they found confirmed what Lazaridis' team had flagged. The Sumerian period samples showed a distinct genetic piece that appears nowhere else in the ancient world, not in small amounts. Not as minor mixing, as a primary piece. The researchers ran the data through principal component analysis, the standard method for mapping genetic ties between populations. On the resulting chart, every other ancient civilization grouped near its nearby neighbors. The Sumerians sat alone, isolated, unconnected, an island of genetic data with no bridge to any known population. Pay attention to this next detail, because it changes the entire picture. The genetic break wasn't gradual. In population genetics, when one group replaces or absorbs another, you see blending signs. Hybrid DNA profiles that show mixing over generations. The shift from Ubaid to Sumerian shows almost no mixing period. One genetic profile ends, another begins. The Max Planck team described it carefully. They called it a sharp population shift. In plain language, that means the Sumerian population didn't slowly emerge from the people who were already there. They appeared. Now, mainstream archaeology has answers for sharp population shifts. Migration, conquest, disease wipeout of the existing population followed by new settlers. All of these are possible. But each of them leaves specific genetic signs that the Max Planck data didn't show. Migration produces founder effects, a narrowing of genetic variety that points to a small group spreading into new land. The Sumerian samples show high genetic variety from the earliest period. Conquest leaves the genetic signature of the winning group mixed with survivors of the beaten group. The Sumerian samples show almost no Ubaid mixing. Disease wipeout followed by new settlers would need a known source population for the settlers. There is none. The Sumerians themselves had an answer to this question. They wrote it down repeatedly. The Eridu Genesis, preserved on tablet CBS 10673 at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, describes the founding of the first 5 cities. It says that before these cities existed, humanity lived without structure, without kingship, without civilization. Then the Anunnaki came down and set up Eridu as the first city on Earth. The text doesn't frame this as myth. It reads like a city record. The Anunnaki chose the spot, laid the base, named rulers, and taught the people how to farm, build, write, and count. The Sumerian king list, preserved on the Weld-Blundell prism, catalog number WB444 in the Ashmolean Museum, takes it further. It records kings who ruled before the flood for tens of thousands of years each. Alulim of Eridu ruled for 28,800 years. Al-Algar ruled for 36,000. These are clearly not human lifespans. Scholars who dismiss the king list as mythology have a problem, because the same document shifts smoothly into proven kings. Rulers whose existence is confirmed by separate carvings, records, and dug-up evidence. The Sumerians didn't separate their mythology from their history. They recorded them in the same document in the same format using the same writing rules. Either they couldn't tell the difference between myth and reality, which clashes with everything else we know about how sharp they were, or they were recording something they thought was equally true. If you're watching this because you want to understand what ancient civilizations actually knew, hit subscribe. I cover suppressed archaeology, genetic mysteries, and forgotten history every single week. The next video is going to connect directly to what we're about to discuss. So, the genetic data shows the Sumerians appearing without a traceable origin, but what the Sumerian text described next made all of that look tame. The Atrahasis epic, one of the oldest story texts ever found, describes the Anunnaki creating a worker species by mixing their own essence with the clay of the earth. The Akkadian word used is temu, which translates to blood, essence, or life force, depending on context. The passage describes a specific process. An Anunnaki named Enki and a birth goddess named Ninhursag carried out the work. They took the blood of a sacrificed god, mixed it with clay, and from this mixture, created the first humans. The text describes 14 first creations, 7 male and 7 female, grown in what the tablet calls the womb of the goddesses. For decades this was read as a creation myth, Mesopotamia's version of Genesis. But the language is strangely step by step. The Atrahasis doesn't describe magic, it describes steps. Part 1, Part 2, growth period, result. And the specific mention of blood, of living material being combined with earthly material to make a new being, reads differently in 2024 than it did in 1924. The tablet goes further. It describes the first attempts as failures, warped creations that couldn't reproduce, that lacked certain functions, that had to be thrown out before the process was refined. This isn't how myths usually work. Myths describe creation as an act of divine will, instant and perfect. The Atrahasis describes trial and error, repeat testing, a building process with versions and fixes, the kind of language you'd use to describe engineering, not worship. And the Atrahasis isn't alone. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic drawn from earlier Sumerian sources, describes Marduk using the blood of the defeated god Kingu to create humanity. Different story frame, same core detail. Divine living material combined with earthly material to produce a new species. The Eridu Genesis tells the same core story from yet another angle. 3 separate written traditions spanning centuries, all describing the same process. Either an entire civilization kept up a coordinated fiction across hundreds of years and multiple independent scribal schools, or they were recording something they all agreed had actually happened. In 2003, the Human Genome Project finished its mapping of human DNA. One of the surprise findings was the presence of what geneticists call orphan genes, stretches of human DNA that have no matching earlier version in any other species. Every living thing shares the vast majority of its genetic code with related species through shared ancestors. Humans share 98.7% of their DNA with chimps, 85% with mice, 60% with fruit flies. The science of genetics predicts that every gene should trace back to an older version in an earlier species, but roughly 634 human genes have no such ancestor. They appear in the human genome with no history behind them, no earlier version in any primate, no broken down copy in any mammal. They exist only in humans, and they code for proteins tied to brain growth, nerve connections, and thinking ability, the exact traits that separate humans from every other species on Earth. This doesn't prove the Atrahasis' literal history, that's not the claim. But the genetic data raises a question that mainstream science has not answered. Where did 634 genes come from if they didn't evolve from anything? The standard answer is that orphan genes come from rapid mutation events or brand new gene creation, processes that are possible in theory but have never been directly seen at this scale in any species. And then there's the haplogroup data. Human populations carry genetic markers called haplogroups, inherited patterns that trace mother and father lines back tens of thousands of years. Every population on Earth carries haplogroups that connect them to known migration routes. Sub-Saharan Africans carry haplogroup L, the oldest line. Europeans carry haplogroups H, U, and J. East Asians carry haplogroups A, B, C, and D. These markers tell us where populations came from and how they moved across the globe. The system works. It has been proven right thousands of times. The ancient DNA pulled from Sumerian period burials carries a haplogroup spread that doesn't match the expected profile for the region. Southern Mesopotamia should show markers in line with the Levantine and Iranian plateau populations that surrounded it. Instead, the samples show a strange buildup of haplogroup J2, specifically the J2A branch, at levels much higher than any nearby population from the same time period. J2A is linked to the spread of farming, but its levels in Sumerian samples go beyond what population genetics models predict for a farming community in that spot. The numbers point to either extreme genetic drift in a small founder group, which clashes with the high overall variety in the samples, or a wave of people from a source population that has not been found. And no, I'm not making that up. The data is published, the strange finding is on record, what's missing is the answer. The Sumerians described themselves using a term that scholars have debated for over a century, the black-headed people or Sag-Gig-Ga in Sumerian. This is usually read as a simple ethnic label, but in context, it's a marking term. They used it to set themselves apart from other populations in the region, not a cultural split, a biological one. They saw themselves as physically and deeply different from the people around them. The texts are specific about what made them different. The Sumerians described the Anunnaki as having given them the seed of mankind, a phrase that appears across multiple tablets and periods. The term in Sumerian, Numen Nam Lulu, points to biological origin, not cultural passing down. When they talked about receiving the me, the building blocks of civilization, they used different wording entirely. Knowledge was given, but their physical existence was created, two separate acts, two separate word choices. The scribes who recorded these traditions were careful enough to keep that split across centuries. In 1976, Zecharia Sitchin published The 12th Planet, arguing that the Anunnaki were beings from beyond Earth who genetically built humanity. Mainstream scholars threw out Sitchin's translations, and some of their criticisms are fair. Sitchin took liberties with certain cuneiform readings. But the core pieces he pointed to, the creation story involving biological mixing, the sudden appearance of civilization, the descriptions of beings from the sky with advanced technology, those pieces exist in the tablets no matter how you translate the edge cases. Sitchin didn't invent the mystery, he just made it public. The Sumerian creation texts support this reading. According to their own records, they weren't a grown version of the local population, they were made, built, shaped by beings who came from somewhere else and mixed their biology with what was already here. And then those beings taught them everything they needed to build the first civilization in human history in a single generation, with no growth period, no trial and error, no slow buildup of knowledge. Just a sudden burst of ability that has no match anywhere else in the archaeological record. Modern genetics was supposed to settle this question. It was supposed to trace the Sumerians back to a boring migration route, a population that moved south from Anatolia or east from the Levant. Instead, it found a genetic profile that doesn't connect to anyone. A sharp population shift with no known source. Orphan genes in the broader human genome that have no ancestor in evolution. And a haplogroup spread that breaks the models. The archaeological record tells the same story the DNA does, if you're willing to read it straight. At every major Sumerian site, Eridu, Ur, Uruk, Lagash, the earliest layers show the same pattern. No growth phase. No clumsy first attempts at writing that slowly get better. No small temples that gradually grow into ziggurats over centuries. The first versions of these systems appear in their most complete form. Eridu's Temple 1, the earliest structure at the site, already follows building rules that would define Mesopotamian sacred buildings for the next 3,000 years. The alignment is precise. The proportions are planned. The buried offerings include objects brought from places thousands of kilometers away. Compare this to Egypt. The path from simple mastaba tombs to the Step Pyramid to the Great Pyramid spans 400 years of visible trial and error. You can trace the building knowledge growing in real time across multiple sites and generations. That progress is normal. That's how civilizations develop. The Sumerians skipped it entirely. There are safe answers for each of these findings taken alone. Poor sample storage, random noise, gaps in the reference database that will close as more ancient DNA is tested. All of those are real possibilities. But taken together, the pattern matches something specific. It matches what the Sumerians themselves wrote on clay tablets 5,000 years ago and stored in temple vaults that we've been reading for 150 years without taking at face value. The scientific world treats these texts as mythology. Beautiful, important mythology, but mythology all the same. The Sumerians describe gods coming down from the sky, building humans, setting up cities, and teaching civilization, mythology. Yet these are the same people who track the precession of the equinoxes, a 25,920-year cycle in the stars, with accuracy that wasn't matched until the 19th century. They made math tables using base 60 that we still use for measuring time and angles. They wrote legal codes, medical texts, and farming guides that show careful, tested thinking. These were not simple mystics making up fairy tales. They were the most mentally sharp civilization of their time, possibly of any time for the next 3,000 years. And they said, again and again, that they were created, that their knowledge was given, not found, that beings from the sky made them what they were. The DNA sits in labs in Boston and Leipzig. The tablets sit in museums in Philadelphia, Oxford, and Istanbul. The data from both sources tells the same story. The Sumerians don't match. They never matched. And the only answer they ever gave for their own origin is the one modern science refuses to look at. Think about what that means. We have a civilization that invented writing, math, star tracking, law, and organized farming. A civilization that appeared with nothing before it in the record. A civilization whose language has no relatives and whose genetics have no ancestors. And that civilization left behind thousands of documents explaining exactly where they came from and how they got here. We've translated those documents, we've cataloged them, we've put them in museums, and then we filed them under mythology and moved on. In 2018, a genetics team compared Sumerian DNA to every known civilization on Earth and found nothing. No match, no connection, no parent population. The Sumerians remain exactly what they always said they were. Something that appeared on this planet, fully formed, with knowledge they didn't develop, and a genetic signature that belongs to nobody else. The question isn't whether the data is real, it is. The question is whether we're willing to follow it where it leads. Because right now, the oldest civilization in human history is telling us something about ourselves, and we keep insisting they're making it up. If this kind of content is your thing, you need to see what I'm covering next. The video on screen goes deeper into what the Sumerian tablets actually describe about the Anunnaki, and it connects directly to what we just discussed. Click it now.